Hey, and welcome to the first episode of Top End Devs. Now, um, I'm actually playing with some of the streaming features for Riverside.fm. And so if you are seeing this stuff, then you're probably, you could be on Twitch, you could be on, let's see, I'm on Twitch, I'm on Facebook, and I'm on YouTube. Tried to figure out Twitter, not quite there yet. And anyway, so you can kind of see my face and see the mess that my office is and things like that. But I wanted to jump on and talk just a little bit about what Top End Devs is. So if you go to topenddevs.com, you can actually go and see what we're working on as far as helping people become the top 1% of software developers, build their careers, learn what they need to learn, things like that. Now, I initially was thinking I'd just go over the kind of the 6 things that you need to do in order to become a top end dev. But I feel like in order for you to understand where I'm coming from and where this all kind of got built out of, you kind of need to understand where I came from getting into software. So initially, when I got into software, I was fiddling around with building websites in my spare time while I was working at BYU. So BYU is the university here, Provo, Utah. And I was a student working in their IT department, and I was helping manage the VMware setup that they had there. And I was working with a guy that was building stuff using the LAMP stack. So he was, Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. And he was building e-commerce sites and having all kinds of success. He was making some money. And so I got into it and I thought, oh, wow, this is cool. I kind of enjoy this. And so I started building a website. And initially, it was actually an apartment finder app, right? So it would help you advertise you were looking for roommates or could find roommates. And it was kind of centered around the university ecosystem. And so it was, if you're going to BYU, for example, you'd be able to find housing around BYU, and people could go in and they could rate, this is a nice place, this is an older place, because some of the apartment buildings were they were old, they were falling apart, but they were super cheap, right? And so if you wanted super cheap, you could go super cheap, and if not, anyway. So I kind of got into web development there, and I really enjoyed it. And I did some other programming for my classes, but that wasn't so much my thing. And I kind of assumed that programming, when I graduated from college, was just going to be more of what I was doing in my classes. And I thought, this is stupid. I don't want to be a programmer. But when I graduated, I got a job at a company called Mosey. And Mosey, they're based over here, Pleasant Grove, Utah. They were acquired by EMC Corporation, which was later acquired by Dell. Dell also acquired their competitor Carbonite, so now they're Mosey by Carbonite. Anyway, while I was there, and this is really where things started to connect for me. While I was there, what happened was they were using Ruby on Rails to build their web component. They did online backup. So effectively what would happen is you could request a restoration of your files that were backed up to their servers from the app, or you could request to get the restored files in a zip file, right? Eventually they offered some other options. But you could do that on the web. And so all of the management, your ability to see what was backed up, all that stuff ran on the web. And when they hired me, I was actually the second guy working in their tech support department. So working at BYU, I had worked on mostly in their operations center and then doing sysadmin stuff. And so I could troubleshoot Windows over the phone in my head. And that was something that really helped out because I could get people to dig in deep, click here, do this, and I could see it in my head, and I could help people get where they needed to go. And what happened was Mosey did 2 things. First, they launched a pro product, and the pro product offered phone support. So it got pretty quickly to the point where I was actually troubleshooting Windows over the phone in my head. The other thing that happened was they were featured in the Wall Street Journal. And by Walt Mossberg, is that his name? Anyway, so business just took off, just crazy, right? And we were answering people's support emails using Thunderbird, Mozilla Thunderbird off of the server, and it just, it was tough, and it didn't really work. And so Tom, the other guy I was working with, he started fiddling around with Rails and started building this system that would pull the emails off of the server, put them into a system where we could see all of our support requests, so kind of a ticketing system. In fact, we eventually built the ticketing system. And then what would happen is if he was answering an email, it would put a flag on it or a mutex on it, so that when I was answering emails, I would just go to the page and it would pull up the next email, right? The next free email. And so then if he responded to it, it marked it as handled, right? And then I would just never see it, and vice versa, right? And so then if somebody emailed back in, it would show you the whole chain, and we could work through things like that. And that's where things really started to click for me with programming. I was going, oh, wow, this is cool. It solves this problem. It's fun to program in. And I really, really got into programming. And it didn't take very long for me to figure out, I really want to be a programmer, right? I mean, I did some other stuff. He and I hired a couple people, and then he moved over to the sales team and was kind of their tech lead. And I hired a whole bunch more people. I actually started a QA process around the app. And this was all leading up to, okay, do I want to be a programmer or do I want to be a manager? And I kind of went back and forth for a while. And what really kind of clinched it for me, there were two things. One was that I was spending more and more time working on this app, and I was really enjoying building these new features in. So I built the knowledge base in, and I think Tom was still working with me when we built like canned replies in. Hey, this is a common problem, right? So we're going to solve this common problem by having a common response for it, right? And so it would paste it in, and then we could actually manipulate it from there, right? So it would paste it in, and I could, if their situation was a little different, or if it was a second or third reply to an email, right, then, I could customize it. You kind of get the idea. But it was fun. I was really, really enjoying it. And I really enjoyed kind of being in the tech world, but also being able to help people out, right? And so there were some aspects of customer service that really, really appealed to me. But I wanted to keep doing more, and I eventually decided I wanted to be on the development team. And so I actually applied to be on the development team, and they told me no, because I didn't have any experience. So I keep working, and eventually some political crap went on. I'm not going to explain the whole situation because it's just not worth it. But eventually I wound up moving over to QA. So at that point, they had hired somebody to come in, set up QA. Her name's Kay Johansson. She's awesome. And I think she's still consulting. She might work for Pluralsight. I can't remember. She's been a couple different places. But anyway, they hired her. She came in. She got things rolling. And then they hired another guy named Don to come in and work with her to kind of take over the QA stuff. And then eventually he needed the help and, politics. So I moved over there as kind of a stepping stone to get to software development. And I really enjoyed that too, right? Because I got to work on interesting problems. I was consistently finding bugs. I held up the release. So when I started QAing stuff, when I was running the tech support department, I was doing it because we kept finding bugs, right? And so the developers would have to find it. And I thought it'd be nice to find these before they went shipped, right? So I wound up holding up the release once there for like 2 or 3 months. Same thing for once I was in QA. Don and I kept finding bugs, and we held up the release for like 6 months. And in the meantime, got acquired by EMC Corporation, which kind of triggered a whole bunch of the political stuff. I was still kind of doing the point stuff for General Electric at the time. This was like more than 10 years ago. But anyway, so we're working all this stuff, and that's where I found podcasting. Don had bought an iPod, and he was listening to podcasts while he worked. And so he'd be over there listening to something, and, I remember one of his favorite shows was Grammar Girl. So she'd say something clever on her show, right? And he'd be over there chuckling. And so finally I just looked at him, I'm like, what are you listening to? Like, what is so funny and interesting? And he turned around and he said, well, I'm listening to podcasts. I was like, oh, well, you know, I'm poor. I just graduated from college. You know, I was making like $40,000 a year. And I was like, I can't afford an iPod, right? I mean, at that point, I think we had 2 kids and one on the way. And so it was just, it was just not feasible, right, for me to go drop iPod money on an iPod. And he goes, oh, well, you don't need an iPod. You can just listen on your computer. So I was running the Mac beta at the time, and I think iTunes at that point was Mac only. So anyway, he helped me get it set up, and I would just listen to podcasts off of the Mac in my office, the Mac Mini sitting on my desk. And, then I, eventually started listening off of my computer at home. I think I bought a real cheap MP3 player that it would sync to. I remember at one point I did, I think I won it in a company thing, but I got an iPod Touch, which I thought was awesome. So anyway, so I'm listening on the iPod. I'm into podcasts. I'm really enjoying this. I was QA for about 6 months, and Don looked at me and asked me how much I was making, and I told him. I don't think you're supposed to do that, but I did. And he looked at me and he said, I don't know how much they're paying you, but I don't think they're paying you what you're worth. So I was like, oh, really? He's like, yeah, you ought to go see if you can get a raise. So, I kind of floated the idea past my boss, and he kind of panned past it. So, and I had also, again, floated moving to the development team, and that was a non-starter too. But I was hungry. I really wanted to get into tech, and I really wanted to get into development. I really just wanted to be there. I wanted to be doing this stuff because I really loved it. And they kept pushing back every time I told them I wanted to write test scripts in Ruby. And so eventually what wound up happening was I went out and I got a couple of job offers, and one of them was a job offer to write code. As I was working for a consulting company here in Utah called SolutionStream, and they needed somebody to do Ruby on Rails, and for whatever reason they hired me, even though I again didn't have any real professional experience on my resume beyond 6 months of QA and we built this thing on the side, right? That somebody eventually took over and completely rewrote. So they hired me, and I wound up working on this system, managing like text messages and stuff like that. And that contract lasted about 6 months, and then they ran out of money. I wound up working for another company building a download.com clone for them, and worked on that for about 6 months, and then something changed in their business, and they couldn't afford to pay us anymore, or pay SolutionStream anymore for my work. And so they called me in and laid me off. And again, I'm just sitting there going, okay, well, I've got a year's worth of experience under my belt now. I could probably get a job here. And at the same time, I'd been podcasting this whole time about Rails. And about 6 months before I got laid off from SolutionStream, and while I was still at Mosey, I'd kind of gotten involved in the Rails community, and I'd met a guy named Eric Berry. And some of you out there might know Eric. He's done a whole bunch of interesting stuff. I think the most recent thing that he's done that was kind of a public thing was Code Sponsor, which eventually shut down. But I thought it was a super cool idea, and he's a terrific guy. But anyway, he was doing a series called Teach Me to Code. And I didn't realize it at the time, but he was trying to sort of recreate Rails casts. So Rails Cast was a weekly video about Ruby on Rails that was put up by Ryan Bates. And it was one of the places where I went to on a regular basis to learn stuff about Rails. And he recruited a whole bunch of us from the Ruby community to contribute videos to Teach Me to Code. And so I think I made one on routing. You can probably still find it. I bet it's still out there. Anyway, so he got into Groovy and Grails, which is a JVM-based framework and language. And he handed Teach Me to Code off to me, right? He was like, well, you're making content, because by that time I had actually started podcasting. And he's like, you're making content. I think you'll keep this going, right? And so he handed it off, and so I kind of inherited Teach Me to Code. And at the time, I would just make videos on stuff I was learning. And so I was kind of emulating Rails casts as well. And then I had the podcast running as well. And so I was talking to people on the Rails Coach podcast, which I eventually rebranded the Teach Me to Code podcast. And I was putting together these videos. You're at right, just showing people how to code. And what's funny is that when I did the video initially for, I'm going to backtrack a little bit because this is how I got my first microphone. I made the video for Eric, and when it got posted, I posted and I said, I tried these couple of systems. I think there was like I Show You or something like that was one of them. And then the other one was ScreenFlow, like real early ScreenFlow. And if you're on the Mac, that's kind of one of the go-to things now to record your screen. And so I had recorded it with ScreenFlow, but I let people know, hey, I made it less than 5 minutes because I didn't have a license to ScreenFlow, right? And it puts a watermark in and stuff like that if you're using the free version. And I was poor and I couldn't pay for it. And at the same time, I was like, and I wish I had a nicer mic. And I just kind of posted that to Twitter. Well, somebody from TechSmith, the company that made ScreenFlow, saw it, got in touch with me, got my address, and shipped me a microphone, and they gave me a free 1-year license to ScreenFlow. And so I was making videos off of this license for Anyway, it was really cool. So once I took it over, I was still on that license, and so I just kept making the videos with ScreenFlow. And whenever I had to upgrade it, then at that point I had a better paying job, and so I would just pay to upgrade it. But anyway, it was just interesting to see how that opened some of those doors. Anyway, so going back to Solution Stream, when that second client said we can't afford to keep him, I got called in by the general manager. Now, when I was hired at Solution Stream, they promised me that they bench people and try and keep them. And so I assumed, okay, well, they're going to bench me for 2, 3, 4 weeks, and I can either learn .NET because that was kind of their main thing. I was one of 2 Ruby developers in their shop. They shopped me to the 2 other clients they had for Rails. Neither of them wanted me. And so, because I was too new, they took one look at my resume and they're like, this guy's too green. So, whoops. I accidentally locked my computer. Anyway, so they called me in, and the general manager just laid me off. So I was benched for a whole half a day. And so, I call up my wife. And I love this because this really illustrates, right? If you're new, you don't have a ton of experience, just some of the opportunities out there. I called up my wife. Or no, I just showed up at home. I just went home. So we lived, 10, 15 minutes from the office. So I show up at home. It's like 10 in the morning. And she looks at me. She goes, what are you doing here? And I could do the math. I think it was our third or fourth wedding anniversary. We had 3 kids, and yeah, she looks at me. She's like, what are you doing home? And I was like, well, I got laid off. And, like I said, it's our wedding anniversary. We were planning to go to dinner that night. And so she's like, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm going to look for another job. And so I got on the internet, and I went to the job boards, which, by the way, is not the way I recommend you find a job, but I was new, and that was what I knew to do. So I went on the job boards, and I started applying to jobs. And I got a phone call about 2 or 3 hours later from a company over in Orem, Utah. We were living in Saratoga Springs. Solution Stream was in American Fork at the time. They've since moved. They're now based in Lehigh. But anyway, so I get this call from this guy named Jared, and he's like, hey, thanks for applying. We are looking for developers. And they hired like 5 or 6 people when they hired me. Just beefed up their dev team like quick. And so I went in, did the interview, and I kind of got okay, well, we'll let you know. And I got a call like 3 minutes after I left their office because he went and he looked at Teach Me to Code, the videos, and then he called me up and he said, these videos are terrific. When can you start? Right? And so I demonstrated that I was proficient in the interview, but what really clinched it for me was having that that content out there. And granted, I literally had 1 year's worth of experience on my resume, so I looked really, really green. So I got hired over there. They put me on a team. Within a couple of weeks, I was the team lead because I was taking charge and, getting stuff done and, designing architecture and things like that. And, to the best of my ability, but I was invested, and I was showing an aptitude, and I was showing that I was eager to learn and to teach people. And so I got to be team lead pretty quickly. And I worked there for about a year. I had some issues with the way the company was run. And in particular, some of it was my boss, Jared, and some of it was the CEO. I just don't know that they were really ready to grow in the way that they did. I don't want to say that anybody was necessarily a bad person, but what they were trying to do and what actually happened was not the ideal setup. So eventually I just got tired of it, and I started applying for other jobs, and I left. And when I left there, where I wound up going was so I had been going to the users groups. In fact, we had hosted several of them at that company, at PMA Media Group is what it was called. And I don't even know what they do now because they've changed things like 80 zillion times. But at the time, we were building a lead gen system for them. But my friend David was working for a new company over at Public Engines, and we were running a website called Crime Reports. Now, I have gone to Crime Reports since I left there, and it is not the same company running it. So just so you're aware. What they're running there is not something that I worked on. And I'm just putting it out there because somebody go, oh, you worked on this? No, I didn't. Anyway, so he was working there, and they were transitioning a system from PHP over to Ruby on Rails. And they needed Rails developers. And again, I got there, and I talked to Dave and Kevin, who were two of the developers there. And then I talked to their boss, Carl. And Carl, I mean, if you know Carl, I don't know how many of you will know Carl, but Carl was kind of a straight shooter. And so if, you wouldn't get the, oh, well, we'll let you know, right? And then never hear from him again. If he was concerned about anything, he would tell you. And he just looked at me and he said, you have 2 years of software development. We're looking for senior people. And, what you bring to the table that way, it's just, I feel like it's kind of a risky move, right? The flip side was that I had, again, demonstrated through the videos and podcasts that I had a whole bunch of skills that they needed, and that I had actually done some of the things that they were looking at, like set up a CI server, some of the more operations stuff that I had done at BYU was super valuable to them. And so he wound up giving me a shot anyway. All right. So when I went to Solution Stream, I basically got a $20,000 a year raise. Kind of held steady when I moved over to PMA Media Group. They were paying me about the same as Solution Stream. But at Public Engines, crimereports.com, they gave me another $20,000 a year raise. And so, I'd been programming for 2 years and I had doubled my salary. Just to kind of put that in perspective. And again, it came back to, learning new things and being willing to experiment and, just figuring crap out and putting out content. And so it all kind of worked out that I wound up working at this place with some really senior guys, and I was able to learn some really terrific stuff from them. PMA Media Group, I didn't get that so much, right? I mean, some of the guys had been programming longer than me, but they either didn't have the as much experience with Rails, or they weren't invested in learning it. And so, anyway, that's the way that went. And at Solution Stream, Solution Street is the company that I'm contracting with now. Solution Stream, I worked with one senior guy, and he was awesome. And, so when we worked on I can't even remember the name of the company, Phone something. Anyway, when we were working on that stuff, we were pairing on all kinds of stuff. And so I learned a ton from him. But then when I switched contracts, when they went under, that client went under, I was working on the other one. I would get some direction and some help from their tech lead, Sam, but he wasn't a Rails expert. He had been programming forever, and he definitely taught me a ton of stuff. But I spent a ton of time working on my own too. A lot more time working on my own, and it didn't mean that But anyway, so at Public Engines, I was working with Dave and with a couple of other people on a fairly regular basis, and then the front end was Flex. And so, some of the Flex guys had a ton of experience too. And so, we were constantly pushing. We went to a couple of local conferences. We were encouraged to be involved in the community. I mean, there was just all kinds of stuff. And so, because of that, my growth curve was just really, 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 really high. And so I learned a ton there. And what wound up happening with them is that they made some decisions that specifically they took the advice of this marketing guy that they hired. And we built out a system that their customers didn't want. Instead of the features that the customers were begging them for. And so eventually they started to lose money. The board fired a bunch of people and then came in and told them that they had to lay off a certain number of people. And so I got laid off. Dave got laid off. A couple of the other guys got laid off. And so I went out and I found a contract, right? And at the time, between the severance and some of the other stuff, we had enough money to live for a few months. And so I made a deal with my wife that if I couldn't find enough freelance work to pay the bills, when we ran out of money, basically, if we couldn't pay our mortgage, then I would go find a full-time job. But I wanted to make a go of it. So I went freelance and I found one contract and then another contract and then another contract, and it all kind of worked out. And so, and there are a lot of lessons in there that I'm just going to gloss over. But I contracted for a whole bunch of different places. And almost a year later, there was a tweet that came out from James Gray. And if you don't know James, he's now pretty involved in the Elixir community as opposed to the Ruby and Rails community. But James posted this tweet, and he basically said, "Hey, I wish there was this panel-style podcast about Ruby, and we should just call it Ruby Rogues." And I replied, and I was like, "Oh, yes, please, yes," right? I've been thinking the same thing. Really, really would love to do this. And so, so we started pulling it together, and we brought in James, and we brought in Aaron Patterson, and we brought in Peter Cooper, and we started the show. And then after a while, we replaced some of the panelists, some of the other ones that were around for quite a long time. And that's how Ruby Rogues got started, and that's how a lot of the rest of the dev chat stuff happened. But what also happened was I was having conversations now with people who were kind of at the top of the industry, because I was still pretty new. I had 2.5, 3 years experience, right, as a developer. And yeah, I was just learning a ton from those guys. And then I was contracting and learning a ton from the people I was working with. And it really just skyrocketed things. I mean, and if I needed work, I'd just go on the podcast and just say, "Hey, I need work." And, I'd get work. I'd have people come to me and say, "Yeah, we'll hire you." And so I would get that, I'd get that work. Got a couple of contracts off of the Rails Coach Teach Me to Code podcast too, and off of Teach Me to Code videos. And so it all just kind of became this place where I could level up quickly. I could ask my questions on the podcasts, get mentorship that way, get mentorship from the people I was working with, and just really kind of take things to the next level with my career. And I was finding clients, and, there were a couple of times where things got a little bit tight, but for the most part, it was great. And anyway, I can't tell you how much I just really, really enjoyed that part of the journey. And I didn't realize when I was in the middle of it just how much there was to what worked for me in order to level up to kind of get to that top level of, I guess, awareness and the top level of, you know, the career, people knowing who I was and being able to find work and, getting paid and all that stuff. I mean, I was kind of at the top end of all of that. And I didn't realize how much of it came together and how much of it really had to do with the consistent the consistent growth and how much, just having content and talking to people and building relationships and going to conferences and all this stuff really contributed early on to my career and being able to get to the place where I was. Now, after about 4 or 5 years, I was doing Ruby Rogues, JavaScript Jabber, Freelancer Show, and iFreaks, and I think we had just started Adventures in Angular. Anyway, things got to the point where I didn't have time to do the podcasts and the freelancing. And so I went to my wife and I talked to her, and I was kind of hoping she'd tell me to be responsible and hold on to my clients, and she told me to do what would make me happy. And so I quit freelancing. I refunded the deposits that people had made, and I went full-time on the podcasts. And my full-time job was then recording the podcasts. Mandy was producing the podcasts at the time, and so I didn't have a ton to worry about there. It was just kind of, being aware, if she needed help of any kind, or, if she was going to take time off and I needed to fill in for this or that. And then finding sponsors. And so that's what I was doing. Made all that happen. And that worked out for 5 or 6 years. Eventually, Mandy and I parted ways. There are a lot of parts of that I regret, but I'm not going to go into that either. But anyway, eventually things got to the point where the podcast network was bringing in a few $100,000 a year. We were producing like 10, 12. I think at the height we were producing like 14 shows. I was going to conferences like every 2 or 3 weeks. I was at a different conference. Meeting with people. They would line up podcast interviews for me. Just all kinds of stuff. I'd go and I'd meet the sponsors of the conferences, and they would, they would sponsor the podcasts. I'd work that out. I'd go to talks where I'd learn all kinds of stuff. It was just amazing. Really, really, really enjoyed that. And things were going terrific. And then in November of 2019, so there were a couple of things that were kind of wrong with that. One was that I was tired. I was kind of burning it at both ends because I was traveling all the time and I was trying to hold everything together, but at the same time things were great. I was really, really enjoying what I was doing. So there were pros and cons to that, but I kind of had this idea in my head of what I wanted DevChat.tv to be at the time, and that's what the podcast network was before it was Top End Devs. But I just never worked on it because things were fine, right? And then in 2019, October 2019, the Twitter cancel mob basically came my way. And what happened was one of my co-hosts on one of the shows posted something that a bunch of these folks took personally. And what was posted was more or less just hey, I wish everybody would get along was more or less the gist of it. But these folks decided that what she was saying was demeaning them in some way. And so I stepped in and I stood up to them, right? And I basically just said, hey guys, I looked at what was said. I looked at the details here, and what you're saying isn't right? The gist of this is this and not that. And you can go find the YouTube videos where I did that. It's all up on YouTube. I never took it down. But at the same time, another friend of mine got in, and he was trying to stand up for him as well, and he was not nice at all. And I didn't condone what he had said then. I still don't condone what his approach, but they were pretty ticked off at him. And so, I addressed that too. And anyway, so they came after me because they didn't like it when I told them that that I didn't agree that on their take with things. And so, yeah, they started really kicking up a fuss. I was traveling at the time, so I kind of had to just deal with it around my other stuff. This was not for a conference, incidentally. That travel was for something else. But, so I basically went off the radar for 2 days and then came back and, addressed whatever else had come along, which was kind of a blessing now that I think about it. But anyway, so that all went down. And then I had a bunch of people come to me and basically tell me I had to cut ties with my friend who had come to the defense of my other friend. And there were a couple of reasons why I didn't do it. I mean, mainly it was because A, we've been friends for a really long time. B, I didn't like his approach, but I got why he was doing it and what he was doing. And C, they were coming to me and telling me I had to cut ties with him because he was being racist and misogynist, and he wasn't. And so at the end of the day, I had a whole bunch of people pull out of the podcast network. So a bunch of the hosts left. They went after my sponsors, and I had a whole bunch of sponsors pull out. And anyway, things got a little bit tough at that point, right? Because they made it hard enough for me to find sponsors that, Anyway, money got pretty darn tight, pretty darn fast. So anyway, and then I went to another conference and I had some stuff go down at that one. They revoked my ticket publicly to KubeCon, and they've never publicly addressed why. They just said code of conduct violation. They couldn't tell me what part of the code of conduct, or they didn't tell the internet what part of the code of conduct I violated. They just publicly denounced me, and that was pretty much that. So anyway, at the end of the day, it turned into this big public thing. And, so I kind of made it through November and December and January. And in January, I started to find new sponsors. And things started to look really good. And then when COVID hit, I didn't have enough of an established relationship with the new sponsors for them to not just wrap up their marketing budget and say, we'll come back when things are a little more stable. And so at that point, things got really tight. And by August, I was really starting to look for a job. And so August 2020, I took a job at Morgan Stanley. I was pretty depressed and pretty angry about things at that point as well. But at the same time, I think you have to kind of hit those low points so that you can recognize who you really are and what you really want, if that makes sense. So anyway, so I took a job at Morgan Stanley, and I was working for their office here in South Jordan, Utah, and did a whole bunch of work for them. And probably January 2021, I kind of rekindled my faith. Not that I had ever quit going to church or anything like that, but I really started to, I guess, feel closer to God. At the same time, I was also really starting to think, okay, is this what I want, right? Is this really what I want to do? Where do I want to end up? What kind of a career, what kind of a life do I want, right? Because at that point, it wouldn't have been terribly hard to, tell the the 6 or 7 shows that we were still producing every week, we just weren't going to produce them anymore. Kind of let the host take them and run with them or whatever, right? But I wasn't sure I wanted to do that. So I spent probably the next 4 or 5 months just figuring out what I wanted. And what was interesting about it was that at the end of it, I really felt like there was something that I wanted to do for the community, but it wasn't just to have shows where we talked about code. And what's funny is that that was kind of how I had framed things with devchat.tv was, hey, we just talk about code, right? That was also why, in a lot of ways, I had kind of shied away from some of the social issues surrounding code, is because it was like, hey, we just talk about code. And so I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure that out and get a handle on what I really wanted. And I really feel like this is something that everybody ought to do with their career and with their life. You just sit down and go, okay, where is this headed? Is this headed the direction I want? Is this, what do I really want? And I really struggled with it because it was, part of me just wanted to build it back to what it was. But, I realized that I wasn't entirely fulfilled by that, right? And that there were some other things that I wanted to do, and that the heavy travel was not really conducive to what I wanted with my family and things like that. And so I really started to think about that. And at the same time, people still weren't traveling, right? They weren't having in-person conferences. They weren't having, a lot of the things that the community did before COVID just weren't happening. And a lot of them still aren't. So I spent a bit of time trying to figure a lot of that out. And eventually I kind of rediscovered what I had wanted to do with devchat.tv early on. And that was to build a community and to help people get to the top of their game, the top of their career. And that was what really connected to me, right? Was all the stuff that I had kind of lived through before, with going to meetups and leveling up and working with terrific people that helped me level up. And, all of the learning and exciting stuff that I was doing early in my career, right? I was constantly learning, constantly growing, constantly challenged, constantly working on stuff that I felt like mattered in one way or another. And I realized that I wanted that, and that I wanted to help other people have it too. And that was really what I needed to focus on. And that the only way that I could do that was really to connect with people, and to connect with them on a different level than just, hey, this is a podcast and you can listen to me. And then if things work out, then you can contact me. And so I started putting things up like, hey, let's do some coaching. And I actually in 2021 did a bunch of coaching. I helped people start a couple of podcasts. I helped people kind of get their careers on the tracks that they wanted, again, related to podcasting. And that was really fulfilling. And that was part of what helped me discover it too, right? Was that I would coach these folks and then I'd see them succeed. And that was great. So I really got into it, really, really discovered that. And I realized that there are some things that the community kind of needs, especially now that we're still semi-remote. Like, I see people traveling more now. I'm seeing more conferences happening in person. We still see some that are happening virtually. I would probably say that 75% of meetups still aren't meeting. And the other 25% are doing it remotely, with the occasional, in-person get-together. But, it's that kind of thing. And the other thing is I talked to people, and as I was coaching people, I coached a whole bunch of people that had kind of gotten to the mid-level or senior dev level and had kind of stalled out like I had, right? And so they weren't learning, they weren't growing, they weren't being challenged, they weren't finding those opportunities to just, kind of go and just own the career they wanted. And I was hungry for that too. And so that's when I kind of conceived of Okay, so what is it, right? What is it that I want? What is it that people ought to be doing in order to have the kind of career that I want, right? And the kind of career that they want. And I also realized that even if you just want sort of the, show up at 8, go home at 5, or work from home, show up at 8, go home at noon, go surfing for 2 hours, come back and finish your work, right? And then go have beers with your friends at night, whatever, right? But at least, you know, to be able to afford that career, you still need to be learning and growing and things like that. You just may not be as keen about it, I guess, as some of the other folks that, may be out there, that really want to speak at the conferences and write books and things like that. So, either way, I feel like everybody ought to be doing this. And we really ought to be focused on, giving people kind of a framework for building their development careers, right? I'm also working on a framework for people who want to start and grow podcasts, but that's a different thing. I teach some of it as part of top end devs because I feel like people ought to be putting out content as part of their careers. But yeah, just understanding, having that framework for how you grow your career, how you get the life you want, right? And how being a programmer and working on technology, whether it's earth-shattering technology or not, can help you have the life you want, right? I mean, that's ultimately what we're talking about here. Is we're talking about that level of growth and that level of commitment, that level of ownership of your career, and then also recognizing that we're busy folks, right? I mean, I have 5 kids. 3 of them are teenagers, right? And so they've got stuff going on all the time. I've got other stuff going on in my life, and so I also had to recognize that, hey, if I'm working full time for a company, I need to be able to do this framework as a part of that, or not take up a ton of time around it, right? And so I really started thinking about it, and I was like, okay, well, what kind of set the framework throughout this whole career that opened up these opportunities, right? That created this place where I could go and kind of have the career that I want, right? Because I have all kinds of options now, and people know who I am. And, I mean, when I was looking to leave Morgan Stanley and find something else, I mean, honestly, I had tons of people talking to me going, we'd like to bring you on board, right? And again, it's because I have this online reputation, and so I can go and I can kind of create whatever opportunity I want. And like I said, there were all kinds of companies that were offering me all kinds of different opportunities. And so I went back through and I just thought, okay, what were some of the things that I was doing? I was like, I was learning on a regular basis. And if I'm being honest, I was probably on average learning something new on a daily basis or pretty close to that, right? Now, I'm not saying I learned like all of Rails in a day, right? Or I learned all of Rails models in a day. No, but I learned some new thing that I could do with them in a day. I learned some new way of connecting that to something else that I was working on that day. Learn something new about the database. Learn something new about this. Learn something new about that. Sometimes I learn something new about communicating with my coworkers, right? But I learn something new every day. And that's one thing that I really wanted to push as part of top end devs is learn something new every day, right? Now, again, right? It could be a new Git command. It'd probably take you all of like 2 minutes, right? It could be some feature of Visual Studio Code or whatever IDE you use, right? It'd take you 5 minutes, right? It could be some new concept in whatever programming language you program in. Our largest audience is JavaScript, right? So you could learn some new fundamental feature of JavaScript, or learn the fundamental building blocks of some library that you're looking at, right? So you can go learn Moment.js or something, right? And kind of learn how it thinks about, time objects in JavaScript. But whatever it is, right? You can go learn a new thing every day, right? And then the other thing is go commit code every day, right? And yeah, you probably do this at work, so that doesn't count, right? You should be committing code ideally related to what you learned, but sometimes you're learning soft skills or something that just you know, doesn't quite go into a commit. But then commit something, right? Which kind of implies that you have some other side project or open source or something that you're contributing to. But one way or the other, yeah, commit code every day, right? So you learn something new every day. You commit code every day. Now the other hack that I had, and these kind of went hand in hand for me for the weekly things, because there are 2 daily, 2 weekly, and then 3 long-term ones, or longer-term ones. So the 2 for weekly, one of them is that one of the ultimate hacks for me was people, right? So I found mentors, or I just met people who could be my mentor for one podcast interview or one conversation, right? I could ask somebody about something that I was trying to learn. So, for example, I went to Mountain West Ruby Conference the first year I went, which was like the second or third year they had it. And I got there early. This is up in Salt Lake. And so I went there, I sat down, and I sat down there next to this guy with a big white beard. He was kind of a heavier guy. And we just started talking, and I was like, okay, people keep talking about mocking and stubbing. What is it? And so he walked me through the whole thing, right? Explained it top to bottom, front to back. Now, I didn't realize I was sitting next to the master teacher, Jim Wyrick, at the time. And if you've been involved in the Ruby community for a long time, Jim passed away, like 5-6 years ago. But he spoke at a lot of the conferences. He was just terrific at explaining things to people and making connections for people. David Brady, who's a friend of mine, lives here in Utah. When I was getting ready to go, he actually said I would pay good money to hear Jim Wyrick talk about oatmeal, right? Because he just explained things so well. And so, so I met Jim Wyrick. And then at other conferences, right, if I had a question, or a lot of times we just wind up going to lunch, right? And just, hey, Jim, let's go to lunch, and I'd meet some of the other Ruby folks like Eric Hodel. I remember the 3 of us went to lunch one time, or, be a part of a conversation with him and a few other folks from the community. And anyway, so those kinds of relationships really helped. David Brady mentored me through a lot of stuff. James, Josh, Avdi, Katrina. I mean, all of them contributed on a regular basis. But then some of our guests, right, for Ruby Rogues, taught me stuff. And so meeting somebody new on a weekly basis is something that I push people for. And that takes a little bit of effort, right? Because you're not going to automatically do that, because you're probably not at public functions on a regular basis. But you can join some communities and just put something out there that basically says, hey, I'd love to meet new people. Here's my link to schedule a Zoom call, and make it work, right? And so you can make it come together. For top end devs, we have a water cooler room using a system called Donut. And so you just go in there and you tell it you want to meet somebody, and it'll hook you up, right? With somebody else who said they wanted to meet somebody. And then you can jump on a Zoom call and get to know them, right? And then hopefully you'll find that you have enough in common to where you want to stay in touch, or maybe you'll just reach out every so often when you have something to talk to them about, right? Because you have a common interest or something like that. But that's something, once a week you should be meeting somebody new. Now, the way that I tend to do this is I invite them on the podcast, right? And so we have a half hour or an hour long conversation on Ruby Rogues, but I get to meet them, right? And then if they have something interesting to talk about, then I'll invite them back for something else, or we'll jump on a call for something else. Or, now we're getting ready to pulse together some of these other things that have to do with the other pieces of this. But, namely meetup groups and summits. And so I'll invite them to come speak at those. But at the end of the day, I mean, that's what we're talking about, is having those relationships. And then you need to be putting out some kind of content on a weekly basis, right? Blog post, podcast episode, YouTube video, something, right? And the reason is because between committing code every day and putting out content every week, if you want to get a job, if you want to speak at a conference, you want to take your career to anywhere beyond sort of the typical, I show up for work, I get a paycheck stuff, that all comes into play, right? Because you are essentially training yourself to learn hands-on. The other thing, though, is that it's a form of job security, and the reason is because you have something that people can go to. So let's say that your employer has been kind of sitting on the information that they're having some kind of struggles, and they're either going to have to lay people off or go or shut the doors, right? And you just don't know, right? Or your boss has a heart attack and the new boss doesn't like you. I mean, whatever, right? And I'm kind of throwing these out there, ideas out there, but stuff like this happens, right? Where, this place isn't what it was anymore. I need to get out of here, right? And having that kind of a portfolio really helps, right? Because now you've got code that you've committed, you've got this side project, you can let them know, hey, look, I've been working on this for the last 3 or 4 years, go check this out. It really, really connects. So, even if nothing else, it sets you up so that you can get out there and you can continue to grow, progress, whatever, right? So, you should be doing all those things. The other thing, though, is that, again, people being the ultimate hack, I tell people that once a month you need to be out to some kind of community deal, right? So some kind of meetup, workshop, whatever, where you are learning in kind of a longer format than like the 10 or 15 minutes we were talking about before, to learn something new every day, right? Where somebody's going to go into depth on something, and then where you can meet people, right? And so we're working on pulling together meetups for each of our communities, right? Probably start with the bigger shows, which are JavaScript, Ruby, Angular, and React. And I think the Vue channel's getting pretty big. But also for like DevOps, Vue, things like that, right? Machine learning. So just putting together a monthly meetup where we have somebody come and present about the stuff, right? And then the system that I'm looking at using also offers basically meetup software where you can put people into kind of a random matchup, everybody sit at a table on a video call, kind of like a Zoom call, and you can connect with people. And so we're looking to do both of those, right? And then, we'll have workshops during the month and we'll do kind of the same kinds of things, right? But at the end of the day, I mean, that's what we're looking at. So you can go to those meetups, or you can go to a local meetup, right? If they're going to have a local meetup, go to that, right? Because you'll meet people in your area, you can meet local employers, you can kind of get an idea of where you're at relative to the market, relative to the community, things like that, and you can kind of stay on top of what's out there. And then we're putting on the summits, right? So I encourage people every 6 months to make it to some kind of conference. If you can go in person, that's better. But if you can't, I mean, just go to a summit, right? Some people live in parts of the world where there just aren't enough people around for them to pull together a local conference type thing, or even a local meetup. And they're not really in a position where they can travel, right? So go to a summit. But, our summits are going to have some of the same elements as the meetups, where you can actually sit down and talk to people about stuff you're interested in, right? So we'll have times where it's sort of a, hey, we're going to have a table for this topic and a table for that topic and then a table for the other topic. And if you're interested, you can stop in and be part of the conversation. And then we'll have other times where it's just, hey, we're having networking hour for an hour, and we're gonna mix people up every 10 minutes, right? And so you kind of get the benefit of hearing talks from experts, and then in the middle of that, you get the opportunity to talk about some of that stuff with some of the other people attending the conference, right? So that's kind of the feel there. And then the last thing is that, and I don't hear anybody talk about this in the programming community at all, but this is something that has really, really helped me, was once I'd been in for a while in the programming community, I started getting into some of the business literature. And in the business literature, they actually encourage you to set goals and try and reach them, right? And this is something that I think is critical, right? If you want to be a speaker at the conferences, at the big conferences, then what you need to do is you need to set goals around submitting talks to so many of the conferences, right? Even the little ones or the summits that we're putting on or whatever, right? You should be setting goals around your learning, right? So one of the things you could be learning every day is how to give better talks, how to deliver a talk, how to design slides, how to write calls for proposals, how to write. And so you mix that in with the I'm going to learn this aspect of this library in React so that I can be good at my job, right? And so those are the pieces, right? Those are all the pieces that I encourage people to put together and be involved in. And the reason is because at the end of the day, those are the things that are going to get you to the place where you want to go. And those are the things that worked for me over the last several years. Is all of those things open doors for me to meet people and learn things that I needed to do in order to get where I wanted to go. And so at this point, I realized that contributing to people in a meaningful way is where I want to be. And I want to be that person in the programming community that has fundamentally changed enough people in the programming community that we change the community itself. And not just to, it's not an ego trip like, oh, I moved it. No, it's because I legitimately helped a whole bunch of people make it better, right? And I can point to and I can say, it wasn't just me, it was that person and that person and that person. And I'm proud that I was able to pour into them a little bit, and then they were able to go and make this kind of a difference in their corner of the world or in their corner of the community or things like that. The other thing is that I feel like the community could really benefit from hearing more points of view, right? And some of them I will agree with, and some of them I will definitely not agree with. But I think we benefit from having those out there so we can discuss them and say, oh, so and so said this, and so said something that was a little bit different. And as I've kind of dived into the two seemingly opposing views, I was able to clarify, and it looks like this is the right path, right? And sometimes they're the fringe voices, sometimes they're the mainstream voices. And you never know where it's going to come from. So if we get more experiences and more ideas out there, I think we really benefit. But the other thing is that I feel like if I go out there into the community and I'm talking to people and meeting people, and I'm talking to people that have a lot in common with me and talking to other people that have nothing in common with me, I can come to understand more people in the community. And I think we can all kind of come together and create a better space where we can make a difference in the world at large. And so that's what I'm looking at. That's what I'm trying to accomplish with Top End Devs. And so, the meetups and the summits and we're putting together videos, right, that you can consume once a day, that are 5, 10, 15 minutes, about different aspects of programming or different aspects of building your career. I'm looking for authors to help me do that, right, with some of the technologies that I either don't know or don't have time to do myself. We're going to keep putting the podcasts out there. We're going to, all these things come together to give you a place where you can go so you can have this, right? You can get into the Slack community and you can meet people. All of these things come together so that you can do this work, so that you can be part of each other's journeys, so that you can enhance your own journey, and so that you can be consistently moving up. And honestly, to me, that's what makes somebody a top 1% developer. Is that they're doing some of these things that nobody else does, and they're consistently making that lift. And what's interesting is that let's say you get 1% better every day, right? So today I made 1% progress. I'm 1% better today than I was yesterday. And tomorrow I'm 1% better than I was today. And the day after that, right, 1%. Well, as that compounds over the course of the year, if you just do that, 1.01%, 1.01 times 1.01, 365 times. At the end of the year, you're 37 times better, right? 37 times better. And so even if you're only a half a percent, I mean, you're still going to wind up 5 or 6 times better, right? And so, I mean, that's what we're talking about here, right? Is what if you were 5, 10, 15, 37 times better at the end of 2022 as you were when it started? I mean, just imagine that. And then imagine that we have a whole bunch of people doing that. I mean, that's what I'm really aiming at, right? And if you make that kind of progress in a year, or even half that progress, or a quarter of that progress, right? So you're looking at 9 times better in a year. I mean, you've made way more progress than most people make in their careers, and you're going to be in that top 1% because you are just blasting past everybody else. And then you can go and you can create what you want, right? So you can create the hey, I want to build a course that helps software developers do better in this area. Or, hey, I want to contribute in this area. Or, I want to start a podcast that makes this kind of a difference. Or, I'd really like to be keynoting at the conferences. There's no reason why you can't. And if you do 37 times as well this year and then you 37 times that next year, I mean, you don't have to do that very many times before you're one of the really elite people that people are really paying attention to. And so that's what we're working on is it's like, hey, look, this is the framework. This is what Top End Devs is all about. And, let's do it. Let's get there, right? Let's open these doors and just knock it out of the park. Because I'm telling you, 37 times is out of the park. I mean, it's out of this world difference. So anyway, I was really, I guess I should tell you what to expect from this podcast feed going forward. Because I don't intend to do an hour and 20-minute podcast episode every time, right? I'll probably do a longer one, which is probably going to be 20 minutes to half hour every week. And then I'm going to do a lot shorter ones where I'm just talking about one piece of the framework, right? So it might be, here's how to meet people, or here's how to meet people who are completely different from you, or here's how to connect with, an expert. Here's how to get them as a podcast guest on your show, or here's how to make your blogs more engaging, or here's how to learn something new from a video. Here's how to learn something new from a podcast. Here's a trick that you can use when you read a book to learn something new. Here are some things where you can commit code every day. Here's some places where you can solve math puzzles with code, right? And you commit that every day. I mean, whatever, right? But the idea is that we are constantly pushing those things forward. And I want to give you ideas and encouragement to the best that I can so that you don't get stuck in your journey, right? You're constantly thinking, okay, this is what I got to do next. This is what I'm going to learn next. This is what I'm going to do. This is the way I want to grow. This is the direction I want to go, right? And so we're going to pull all of that together and we're going to make those connections for you so that at the end of the day, you know what to do so that you can live up to this framework. I'd like to put this together into a challenge. I'm still working on that part of it. But for the meantime, just go to topenddevs.com and sign up, and you'll be able to connect and get the content that we're putting out there. And I think this is where I'm going to wrap up. So anyway, just keep in mind that, most of the episodes are going to be like 5-10 minutes. And then once a week, there will be a 20-minute episode, except this one that's an hour and a half. But it's awesome to talk to you. If you want to get coaching from me, you can go to topenddevs.com/coaching. I usually do the first call for free, so you just fill it in and it'll send you a link. And what that's for is basically to figure out, if you're a good fit, if I think I can really help you, longer term. Sometimes it's, look, you've got to do these things over the next 3 months, and I don't need to be checking in on you, right, to get them done. And sometimes it's, hey, let's make progress every month. Like if you wanted to launch a podcast or a YouTube channel or something like that I've done, it's like, okay, we're going to get this far this month, and then we're going to get this far next month, right? So we'll get you launched in the first month, and we'll get you growing in the second month, and we'll, you know, start turning listeners into leads so that you can sell the course that people need, right? And so anyway, but definitely go check that out. Go check out the content that we have under Top End Devs, and I'm adding in. I've done probably 20 or so summits. We're going to put all that content under Top End Devs, and yeah, we're just going to kind of go from there. So if you're looking for any of that stuff, let me know. And yeah, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. All right. Go over to Riverside and stop.